A lot of people are worried that the US dollar could eventually fail. I personally think this could happen, but I also think that it may not happen for a very long time. In this video, I want to explain to you what the world reserve currency is, why the US dollar is the world reserve currency, what currencies have been the world reserve currency in the past, and why I think Bitcoin could potentially take down the US dollar. Let's start with what a reserve currency is. A reserve currency is a large quantity of currency maintained by central banks and other major financial institutions to prepare for investments, transactions, and international debt obligations. What they're doing is they're holding this money for potential future expenses. So if they have any expenses that they need to pay for, if they need to buy something, they're going to use these reserve currencies to pay for these goods and commodities that they need. For example, a lot of commodities like gold and oil are priced in a reserve currency, and the current world reserve currency is the US dollar. So the entire world uses the US dollar as the reserve asset. You can trade the world reserve currency for any goods and services around the world, and pretty much the entire world agrees on using this currency as the world reserve asset. The world reserve currency is the one that's generally accepted around the world, and everybody in the world will be willing to trade you goods and services in exchange for that currency. If you take the US dollar anywhere in the world, you can generally exchange it for any other currency. So for example, if you wanted to go to Thailand and you wanted to get Thai baht and you have US dollars, you can give away those US dollars. You can find a place that'll accept those US dollars in exchange for the Thai baht. When the entire world agrees on one currency, it becomes the world reserve currency. In the past, we've had multiple reserve currencies. So you can see here that there are 7 reserve currencies right on this list here. And then we have the US dollar. There's basically three forms of the US dollar. So the US dollar before the Bretton Woods Agreement, the US dollar during the Bretton Woods Agreement, and the US dollar after the Bretton Woods Agreement. And on this graphic, the person created it, BTCM Research, they're predicting that Bitcoin will eventually be the world reserve currency, and I completely agree with this. But before we go into that, I want to explain to you why the US dollar is the world reserve currency. Different countries have their own currencies. There are multiple ones being used to store reserves, but the US dollar has the biggest share of reserve assets. And there's a senior economist from Vanguard who explained why. So he has 3 reasons. The first reason is that the US is traditionally a strong sovereign nation, so they have robust, persistent economic growth. The second reason is that the US government ensures that property rights are maintained, and they're generally not going to interfere with them. The third one is the fact that the world uses the US dollar. That's one of the reasons why the currency is even used to begin with. It's used because other people use it. The more people that use a currency, the bigger the network effect, and the better the advantages of using it to save in it. You know for a fact that if the entire world uses the US dollar, it will retain its value over time. So it will be valuable tomorrow, the following day after that. Part of the reason why the US dollar became the world reserve currency is because of the Bretton Woods Agreement. So the Bretton Woods Agreement was an agreement between 44 countries to use the US dollar as the reserve asset that they would keep. So the US dollar was supposed to be pegged to gold. It was supposed to be pegged at $35 per ounce of gold. So they won't produce more dollars than the amount of gold that they have in their vaults. And the amount of dollars that they could produce was $35 per ounce of gold. And of course, the US government went against this. They didn't do that. They printed tons of money to fund the Vietnam War. They used it to fund the Great Society program. And all of this newly printed money worried other countries who were saving in the dollar, and they were expecting the dollar to retain its value. They were worried that it may not have that value anymore in the future. One of the benefits of this system was that the entire world was able to trade in a currency that was stable and in a currency that retained its value over time. It could also be moved from place to place very easily. The importance of this stability is that it makes business easier, it makes commerce easier, it makes it easier to trade goods and services for value. So if you wanted to sell something and there is no stable form of money, you don't know how much to charge for it. And the US dollar made it a lot easier for countries around the world to trade, to spend, and to create more value and exchange value and create synergies between those countries. The Bretton Woods Agreement also created the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. I'm not going to go into this, but they essentially monitor the exchange rates and make sure that any countries that need support get support. So they'll lend money to them, they'll create more money out of thin air, and they'll lend it to them. This is part of the reason why I don't like the dollar. But eventually, the Bretton Woods Agreement collapsed because the US government had printed too many dollars. They had devalued the US dollar relative to gold. So if all these other countries who held dollars wanted to take their gold back from the US government, the US government wouldn't be able to pay them back. By 1973, the Bretton Woods system collapsed. Each country has their own currency and they could peg it to the price of gold. But what a lot of countries chose to do was they let the value of their currency float and they allowed market forces to determine its value. So based on supply and demand, whichever currency was in higher demand would go up in value. Whichever currency was in lower demand would go down in value. This is essentially what the world is using right now. Most currencies are not pegged to another currency. So if we have the Canadian dollar versus the US dollar, if more people want the Canadian dollar, the value of the Canadian dollar will increase. If more people want the US dollar, the value of the US dollar will increase. The Bretton Woods Agreement is not in effect anymore. Keep in mind that this was only the case when the US dollar was backed by gold. There was always a possibility for anybody who has dollars to go to the US, exchange their dollars for gold, and go on with their day. The current system is completely different. The current system is it's not backed by gold anymore. The dollar is not backed by gold anymore. It's backed by nothing. It's essentially backed by trusts. There are no countries around the world that use the gold standard, and the dollar is essentially backed by trust in the US government's ability to generate revenue, so to generate taxes. Other countries are using the US dollar to save for the future. If they ever need oil, gold, wheat, any kind of commodity, they can generally pay for it with this US dollar's savings that they have. The bottom line here is that the US dollar is very liquid. It's easy to buy and sell things with the US dollar, so you can use the US dollar to trade. Commodities are priced in US dollars because the dollar is widely used. It has a massive network effect. Billions of people around the world are willing to accept the US dollar, meaning that if you're paid in the US dollar, you can pretty much guarantee that you'll be able to exchange it for goods and services at some point in the future. The US dollar is also very convenient. Anyone can use the US dollar, go anywhere, and spend that US dollar because it has value everywhere in the world. The US dollar is also really easy to invest. You can buy treasuries, you can buy stocks, you can go to the US and buy prime real estate, and all of these are denominated in the US dollar. The US dollar can also be borrowed and lent in the deepest, most liquid capital markets in the world, meaning that there are always people who want to participate. So there are always people who want to either lend to you or they want to borrow dollars from you because the US dollar is used as money everywhere in the world. If you ever have money that you wanted to lend out, there are always going to be businesses around the world that are willing to take that dollar and pay you interest for it. The US does have the strongest economy in the world, and it's stronger by a significant margin. So, for example, the US government has a nominal GDP of $28.78 trillion, while China has a GDP of $18.53 trillion. GDP is the gross domestic product. It's the amount of value that's being created within that country. Because the US has the biggest economy, other countries know that if they were to take those US dollars, they can go to the US and exchange those dollars for goods and services, whatever those goods and services are. But in the past, every single currency has failed. And there are 5 currencies here from Forbes, an article from Forbes. You can see here that there are 5 currencies that have failed. These are just the most notable ones. Germany's paper mark failed because of excessive printing. Printed money to pay salaries, and they went to hyperinflation. Same thing with the peso. They increased their money supply. They continued to increase their money supply until it was no longer exchangeable for goods and services. Both of these currencies, people had to use wheelbarrows because they were worth nothing. So you had to have a stack of money to pay for a loaf of bread, for example. The dollar in Zimbabwe had the same thing. They had massive budget deficits, so they were printing tons of money to pay for things that they promised their citizens, or to just manipulate the market, or even to extract wealth out of the economy. Same thing with Peru, the sol. Same thing with the Chile escudo. As soon as inflation completely gets out of hand, the world stops using a currency as its reserve asset. All of these currencies lost a significant amount of purchasing power, meaning the people who saved in them could no longer afford the things that they need to survive. I think we're starting to see this with the US dollar as well. The people within the US don't actually want to hold the US dollar. They're investing. They buy other things in the place of the dollar. The rest of the world is still using the US dollar, but the people in the US don't want to hold it. So Everybody else is using the US dollar to save for the future. The world reserve asset is being used as a reserve asset everywhere but in the US, because the US citizens have the best access to any asset that they want to buy. They can buy prime real estate, they can buy stocks, they can buy bonds. More recently, the US dollar has started to lose trust as the world reserve currency because of the inflation rate. The value has dropped by something like 99.9% over the last 90 years. More recently, over the last 5 years, the US government borrowed 40% of the supply of US dollars and they added it to the economy. They gave their citizens stimulus checks. They spent money on bailing out companies. They borrowed tons of money to fund wars and just death and destruction around the world. The US dollar has also lost a lot of trust because of the sanctions that the US government placed on Russia. The US government froze $350 billion of Russian assets, so about half of its reserves, and about 70% of Russian banks' assets were also frozen, which is very scary because if you think about it, this is money that the Russian government had earned from selling oil or selling any other commodities. I'm not trying to make this political. I'm not talking about what Russia did was whether it was right or wrong. The point here is that if you're saving in a currency, if you're using it as a reserve asset, you need to trust that it'll be there when you need it. Doesn't matter what the use is for. Nobody can dictate that. Nobody can stop you from using your money how you want to. There's always going to be someone who doesn't like your use of your money. That doesn't mean they should be able to freeze your money and stop you from using it how you want to. This is a massive problem because if the US government can freeze Russia's assets, who's to say they can't stop Japan from using their assets or China? Who's to say that your assets won't be frozen? So over time, the world is figuring out that the US government controls way too much. It can pause anyone's money. The US government can stop countries from being able to transact. It can completely destroy a country's economy by just taking away its ability to send and receive money. So now I think the world is going to move to something that's more decentralized, that nobody can stop you from spending, even if you did something wrong. And money shouldn't be about punishing people who commit crimes. You shouldn't assume that people will commit crimes, and so you should have control over them, and you should be able to punish them. It's about not being able to take control of somebody's ability to spend the money that they worked hard to earn. The US sanctions on Russia are having massive problems, and the trust in the US dollar is fading. People are still using it, but it is fading because what it tells you is that if you're a saver and you're spending less than you're earning, if you're delaying gratification, your wealth, everything that you save can be taken away from you. When the US government sanctioned Russia, it gave everyone else in the rest of the world a reason to diversify into other assets. So for example, Russia is now diversifying into gold, Bitcoin, and other currencies like the yuan. Here's a great visual representation of what the differences between these currencies are, between these assets that we can use as currencies. Fiat currencies are just currencies that are government issued currencies. So dollars, euros, all these currencies. The US dollar got an F for scarcity, meaning that if you hold the dollar, it doesn't matter how much wealth you've saved. It doesn't matter what you did to earn that money. The US government can print more of that dollar, add more of it to the economy, and devalue what you've saved. For example, if you had saved in US dollars from 2020 all the way till today, you would have probably lost 30, maybe even 40% of your purchasing power. So if you had saved $100, you could now buy only $60 worth of goods from 2020. So whatever is worth $60 in 2020, you can now buy only that much, even though you saved $100. Gold works great as money, but the issue with it is that it's not portable, it's not divisible enough, and it's not censorship resistant, meaning that you can't really use it as money. It worked as money because we traded between people, between peer-to-peer, person to person. If you have to trade country to country, or if you have to trade from yourself to maybe a large multinational corporation, gold doesn't work as money. Because if you wanted to pay for something to Amazon, if you wanted Amazon to deliver something to you, would you take a gold bar to their head office to pay them? I don't really think so. I don't think that makes any sense. So gold doesn't work as money in a digital economy. The third alternative is Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is succeeding in every single one of these categories. The only one that it can't succeed in is an established history, because obviously gold has been around for 5,000 years. Bitcoin's only been around for 15 years. You can't rewrite history to make it so that Bitcoin has an established history. That's not how things work. Bitcoin is just going to take time. It's going to take time for more people to adopt it, to see what it is, to understand it. It's going to take probably another couple of years, maybe a decade, until people really understand what it is. And by then, the price will be much higher. So now Russia saves in gold, Bitcoin, and the yuan. They also keep their own rubles. But since the US government is able to stop an entire country from being able to transact with the rest of the world is incentivized to save and move away from the dollar because the US government can do that to them as well. Gold, of course, doesn't work in a digital economy. Like I said, it's a physical currency. It's a physical asset. So you can't send it over the internet, meaning that you can't make e-commerce work with gold. If we go back to gold, we go back to the Bretton Woods Agreement, where the US government holds all of our gold and the rest of the world has to use the notes that the US government creates out of thin air. It doesn't work as money because it's physical. You can't send it over the internet. You can't use it for e-commerce. A lot of transactions right now are digital. We're not going into stores as much. Brick and mortar stores are shutting down. A lot of the transactions that I have are digital. I'm not going to a store and giving somebody gold. Most of my transactions aren't even cash. Just transacting with a credit card or a debit card. That's the case for most people. So the issue here is if countries stay on the US dollar standard, the US could block them from using their savings. It could shut them out from the rest of the world. So 5 countries came up with a solution. There were Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These countries are working together to create a currency that they back. They take control of. They take this control out of the US government's hands and they take control of the entire system. But I don't personally think that BRICS is a threat to the US dollar because it takes us back to the Bretton Woods Agreement, where 44 countries agreed to use the US dollar to make trade easier. So if BRICS and the US dollar were to compete, we'd have the same situation where half the world is using one currency and half the world is using another currency. We wouldn't have the same network effect that we have with a single currency for the entire world. I also don't think that most Western countries are going to adopt BRICS because it takes control away from them. The BRICS currency is controlled by countries that are essentially their rivals, and it makes it so that these Western countries lose control of the economy in the future. The yuan could maybe compete, but again, Western countries probably won't want to hold the yuan in their reserves because China has full control over that money. They could enforce your payments. They could stop you from transacting. They could take the US government's ability to transact away if the US government were to save in the yuan. But now I think most of this is irrelevant because we have a much better store of value that's available to everybody in the world, and this asset is Bitcoin. I personally think it would be to the US government's advantage if Bitcoin becomes the world reserve asset because they already own some. And if the US dollar were to fail and we had to find an alternative, if it ends up being the yuan or if it ends up being the BRICS currency, the US government loses a significant amount of its power over the global economy. One of the things that has made the US economy so big is the ability of the US government to borrow unlimited money. If we go to the yuan or the BRICS currency, it means that some other country is taking this power and the US government would lose in this economy. If that other country can print more money at will, it can devalue the savings of every other country. So to the US, this is a disadvantage. Bitcoin is something that you can send and receive anywhere in the world. There's no need to ask for permission. There's no central party, and there's no blocking of transactions. The Bitcoin network isn't centralized within one group of people or one country. Anyone can run a Bitcoin node. People are running Bitcoin nodes from everywhere in the world. Nodes are essentially just running the Bitcoin software and ensuring that transactions follow the rules of the network. There's no single country or group that can stop anyone else from spending their Bitcoin. Because of these nodes being so widely dispersed, it means that no country controls it. No individual has power over the network or can change the rules of the network. Bitcoin also can't be confiscated because you can't stop someone from saving in Bitcoin. The only requirement if you want to hold Bitcoin is to store 12 or 24 words. If you hold these words and nobody knows about them, they can't take your Bitcoin. They can't steal your Bitcoin from you. This means that anyone can hold their own assets without relying on banks. I do still think that banks will have some role on a Bitcoin standard, but the role will be much smaller than it is today. Today, banks hold everyone's savings. We keep our savings in the banking system because we don't want to keep them at home. If you have $1 billion in cash, you can't really keep that at your house. If somebody walks into your house, if your house burns down, your savings are gone. But with Bitcoin, anyone can take self-custody. There's no need for banks anymore because, like I said, all you need is a private key to access your Bitcoin. With Bitcoin, it's also not possible to sanction someone's savings because as long as you have your private keys, you can sign transactions and you can send your Bitcoin anywhere in the world. I think if we move to any other government issued currency, we're just going to go through the same cycle again where we went through the Bretton Woods Agreement where the US dollar was backed by gold and the US government took advantage of everybody else's trust. Maybe we go to another currency where it's backed by Bitcoin, but I don't think that that's even needed because everybody can take Bitcoin. They can just hold their own Bitcoin. Why give one country power when you don't need to? One of the reasons why Bitcoin works so well is that there's no need for central third parties. Nobody controls it. Nobody stops it. It's like a virus. Everybody's going to eventually be touched by it. So yes, I do personally think that the US dollar could fail. I think it'll take some time. I don't know how long it'll take. It could take a year. It could take 50 years. I think eventually we're all going to be using Bitcoin because it is specifically designed to be the world reserve asset. I don't know how long it'll take. Like I said, I don't know when it'll happen. But I strongly believe that eventually we're all going to have Bitcoin wallets on our phones and we're all going to be sending and receiving Bitcoin regularly. This is also why I think Bitcoin is a much better savings tool than real estate. Real estate only works as a savings tool on a US dollar standard. The US dollar has to continue to decrease in value in order for real estate values to be maintained or to go up. If you want to learn about why I think real estate values are going to crash in terms of Bitcoin, make sure you watch this video on your screen right here.